As Mrs. Claus and Randy and Dandy mentioned at the beginning of the service, our church Christmas party is next Sunday night at 6 o'clock. I hope you can join us. One of the highlights of that party, of course, is when Santa comes and children from the age of 1 to 100 sit in his lap and share what they would like for Christmas. And some even bring their Christmas list. And each year, I like to read letters from children to Santa. Here are some of them. Dear Santa, there are 3 little boys who live in our house. There is Jeffrey, who is 2, David, who is 4, and Norman, who is 7. Jeffrey is good some of the time. David is good some of the time. Norman is good all of the time. I am Norman. Dear Santa, last year I asked you for a new baby brother. This Christmas I want you to take him back. Love, Susan. Love, Susan. Dear Santa, I have been trying to be a good boy. I would like a remote control semi-truck with a ramp. And please make my brother Robert nicer. And please bring him back when he is nice. I love you, Brian. Please bring him back. Did you notice there's a sibling theme going on in these letters? Here's one without that theme. This must be an only child. Dear Santa, if you bring presents that need batteries, bring batteries. We've all had those Christmases, haven't we? That's David. And P.S., am I on the bad list or the good list? You know, children don't usually question whether or not there is a Santa Claus. The big question for them is, which one is the real Santa? It must be confusing for them. Children go into a store, they see Santa. 10 minutes later, they go to another store, they see another Santa. They go home that afternoon, watch television, and see Santa again. And now we have 300 channels or so you can see 10 different Santas at the same time. It must be very confusing. And I remember that each one of my children asked me at one time in their life, Daddy, which one is the real Santa? I wondered that myself, and I imagine you wondered that at one time as a child. And if you have a child or a grandchild, be ready to respond to that question, which one is the real Santa? Now, if you know your church history, you can always share with them the story of St. Nicholas, because in a sense, he was the real Santa. You know, we don't know much about him. Many legends have been built around him. We believe Nicholas was born around 270 A.D. in what is present-day Turkey. He was the only child of wealthy parents, but his parents died when Nicholas was young, and Nicholas inherited all of their wealth. He felt a call to ministry, and then he studied for the priesthood, and then at a very young age, he had the honor of being appointed Bishop of Myra, which is a Greek town on the southern coast of Turkey. Now, living on the coast and helping sailors, Nicholas became a favorite of sailors and fishermen of ships and sailing. Known as the Lord of the Sea, this protector of sailors became the patron saint of Greece and the patron saint of the Greek Navy. In 325, he was one of the bishops who attended the Council of Nicaea and one of the bishops who signed the Nicene Creed. One of the many legends about Nicholas involved a family with 3 daughters. No men had offered to marry any of the daughters because their father was too poor to afford a dowry. Nicholas took 3 pouches, filled each one with gold, and then at night, under the cover of darkness, he crept to the family's home, tossed a gold-filled pouch through each of the daughters' window, and not long after, all 3 girls were married. Well, from this story and other stories surrounding Nicholas rose the belief that unexpected gifts come from St. Nicholas. And children started putting out their shoes and their stockings on Christmas Eve in hopes that St. Nicholas would come in the night to fill them with candy. Eventually, a seminary professor named Clement Clark Moore gave Nicholas 8 reindeer and gave us the poem, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." Then cartoonist Thomas Nast made him big and fat and dressed in red, and the rest is history. But behind these contemporary images of St. Nicholas is an orphan boy who gave his life to Christ and who devoted his life to serving others. That's the real Santa Claus. Now, the big question in Israel during the time of Jesus wasn't who is the real Santa Claus. The big question back then was, who is the real Messiah? It's a question the people of Israel asked all the time. There were many people pretending to be the Messiah, and there were others who were mistakenly put in that position. Many people thought John the Baptist was the Messiah. He was very popular, had a huge following, kind of like the Pied Piper of Palestine. And people came up to him and asked him one time, "Are you the one? Are you the real Messiah?" And John said, "No, I am not the one. I am not the light. I came to bear witness to the light." You see, one of the great things about John the Baptist was his humility. Never thought about that much before. But when Jesus began preaching and doing miracles, the huge crowds around John began to dwindle. His disciples panicked and said to him, "Rabbi, at one time Jesus came to you, and now he has left you and is baptizing people on his own, and everyone is going to him now." And John says, "He must increase, and I must decrease, for he is the one. I'm not even worthy to untie his sandals." And so followers of Christ should always be striving for humility, always aware of the destructive influence of the ego. St. Nicholas came bearing gifts at night when people were asleep. He didn't want the attention. He didn't sit in the living room with his feet propped up, waiting for people to wake up and to tell him thank you. So one of the reasons that both John the Baptist and St. Nicholas were effective servants of God was their humility. It didn't matter who got the credit. And it's been said that a person can accomplish amazing things in his or her life if that person doesn't mind who gets the credit. I read about a couple who make it a tradition every Christmas to make sure that the most expensive gift they give is an anonymous gift given to someone who cannot pay them back. They said that the inspiration for this practice came from St. Luke's Gospel when Jesus says, "If you invite someone to a meal, invite someone who won't invite you back. And if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you?" You see, I'm not suggesting that we don't give gifts to our loved ones, But this year, why not plan to give one of your big gifts to someone who has no way of ever giving back to you? It will stretch you. It will help you grow. And I imagine that once you begin, you will be like this couple who will keep it. You will keep it as a tradition. It will become part of you. Now, as a child at Christmas time, I had an even bigger question than which one is the real Santa. At least it was a much more important question for me. This question deep inside of me was, what is Santa really like? You see, there are no childhood pictures of me with Santa. If you went through the Hester family album, you won't find one picture of little Billy Hester sitting on Santa's lap. Not me, not with that guy. I was scared to death of him. Every time my mother tried to get me close to that hairy giant figure in red, I screamed bloody murder. You people don't know how much I admire the children who climb into Santa's lap at our church Christmas parties. They amaze me. I don't know how they do it. Now here's the thing. I still wanted Santa to come to my house on December 24th. I just didn't want to see him. I still wanted Santa to bring me presents, but I didn't want to be with him because I was scared to death of him. I wasn't sure I could trust him. Santa from a distance was mighty fine, but up close and personal was a different story. And for many of us, the same is true about our relationship with God. God is fine from a distance, but up close and personal is a different story. We want God to bless us. We still want to receive gifts from God, but we don't want to be with God because we don't know if we can really trust God. We don't know what God is really like. And if God has anything to do with deadly storms or automobile accidents or untimely heart attacks or battles with cancer or AIDS, then we especially don't want to have anything to do with them. Give me any gifts you may have for me, but Lord, please keep your distance. We may not consciously think these thoughts, but my suspicion is that these thoughts and feelings are way down deep inside of us. I recently bought a book about Advent by the Christian mystic Evelyn Underhill, who I mentioned last Sunday. She wrote about the instruction that Jesus gave about prayer and about spending time with God. She reminds us that Jesus said, when you pray, enter a room and shut the door. Evelyn points out that shutting the door is very difficult for us to do. We want to keep it cracked just at least a little bit. Keep it cracked open just a little bit. But the instruction is to turn off in everything. To turn away and turn off cell phones and iPhones. To get away from computers and televisions. Anything that will distract you. Anything that reminds you of the worries, the interests, the conflicts, the joys and sorrows of daily life. Christ said, shut the door, and he meant shut, says Evelyn. She says the voice of God is very gentle. And we cannot hear it if we let other voices compete. But shutting yourself up in a room with God can be a very scary thought if God is someone you can't trust. And so how can we do it? It's something we need to do in order to thrive as spiritual beings having a human experience. But there are many human experiences that we have that have made us question God and God's nature and God's motives. How difficult it must be for someone to trust God if their parents were abusive. How difficult it is to trust God if they were abused as a child by a priest. How difficult it is to trust God if their minister preached hell, fire, and damnation sermons telling everyone how bad they were. Who wants to be locked up in a room with a God like that? The joy of Christmas, why we have so much to celebrate, is because Jesus has come to tell us what God is like. He came and showed us what God is like. He revealed that God is love and that God loves unconditionally, cares for us with infinite compassion, and that God doesn't want a long-distance relationship with us. And we so need this relationship, this intimacy, this connection with the one who created us, the one in which we live and move and have our being. A good resource to help us in this process is a good book by the Franciscan priest Richard Rohr, a book titled Immortal Diamond. Immortal Diamond, The Search for Our True Self. Here's an excerpt from it. Which comes first? Does feeling safe and held by God allow you to deal with others in the same way? Or does human tendencies allow you to imagine that God must be the same, but infinitely so? Rohr writes, I do not suppose it matters where you start. The important thing is that you get in on the big secret from one side or the other. The big and hidden secret is this: an infinite God seeks and desires intimacy with the human soul. Richard Rohr's Immortal Diamond. You might want to get that one. I had a favorite teacher when I attended Princeton Theological Seminary. Her name was Dr. Frida Gardner. She taught Christian education. She was the first woman to be tenured at Princeton. An amazing teacher. And one day she read an essay I will never forget. It was written by the great writer Annie Dillard, and it can be found in her book, Teaching a Stone to Talk. Not a Christmas goes by that I don't read this essay. It's one of the most profound and powerful essays I've ever read. It's titled, God in the Doorway. One cold Christmas Eve, I was up unnaturally late because we had all gone out to dinner. My parents, my baby sister, and I. We had come home to a warm living room and Christmas Eve. Our stockings drooped from the mantel. Beside them, a special table bore a bottle of ginger ale and a plate of cookies. I had taken off my fancy winter coat and was standing on the heat register to bake my shoe soles and warm my bare legs. There was a commotion at the front door. It opened and cold wind blew around my dress. Everyone was calling me, "Look who's here! Look who's here!" I looked. It was Santa Claus, whom I never, ever wanted to meet. Santa Claus was looming in the doorway and looking around for me. My mother's voice was thrilled. "Look who's here!" I ran upstairs. Like everyone in his right mind, I feared Santa Claus, thinking he was God. I was still thoughtless and brute, reactive. I knew right from wrong, but had barely tested the possibility of shaping my own behavior, and then only from fear, and not yet from love. Santa Claus was an old man whom you never saw, but who nevertheless saw you. He knew when you'd been bad or good. He knew when you'd been bad or good, and I had been bad. My mother called and called, enthusiastic, pleading. I wouldn't come down. My father encouraged me. My sister howled. I wouldn't come down, but I could bend over the stairwell and see. Santa Claus stood in the doorway with night over his shoulder, letting in all the cold air of the sky. Santa Claus stood in the doorway, monstrous and bright, powerless, ringing a loud bell and repeating, "Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas." I never came down. I don't know who ate the cookies. For so many years now, I have known that this Santa Claus was actually a rigged-up Miss White who lived across the street. That I confused the dramatis personae in my mind, making of Santa Claus, God, and Miss White an awesome, vulnerable trinity. This is really a story about Miss White. Miss White was old. She lived alone in the big house across the street. She liked having me around. She supplied me with cookies, taught me things about the world, and tried to interest me in finger painting, in which she herself took great pleasure. She would set up easels in her kitchen, tack enormous slick soaking papers to their frames, and paint undulating undersea scenes, horizontal smears of color sparked by occasional vertical streaks which were understood to be fixed kelp. I liked her. She meant no harm on earth. And yet, half a year after her failed visit at Santa Claus, I ran from her again. That day, a day of the following summer, Miss White and I knelt in her yard while she showed me a magnifying glass. It was a large, strong hand lens. She lifted my hand and, holding it very still, focused a dab of sunshine on my palm. The glowing crescent wobbled, spread, and finally contracted to a point. It burned. I was burned. I ripped my hand away and ran home crying. Miss White called after me, sorry, explaining, but I didn't look back. Even now I wonder, if I meet God, will he take and hold my bare hand in his and focus his eye on my palm and kindle that spot and let me burn? But no, it is I who misunderstood everything and let everybody down. Miss White, God, I am sorry I ran from you. I am still running from that knowledge, that love from which there is no refuge. For you meant only love, and I felt only fear and pain. So once in Israel, love came to us incarnate, stood in the doorway between two worlds, and we were all afraid. Maybe that's why the very first words out of the mouth of the angels when they spoke to the shepherds were, "Do not be afraid. For to you I bring good news of great joy for everyone. Today a Savior has been born. He is the Messiah, the Lord." I blew it as a child. I never got to sit in Santa's lap. I missed out on a wonderful opportunity and experience because I was afraid. And now I know that there was nothing to fear. Santa was there to offer me love and acceptance. But I missed out. This Christmas, give yourself the best Christmas present you can possibly receive. Sit in God's lap and share your desires, your needs, your fears, your anxiety. God wants to be with you. Do not be afraid.